Hello and welcome to our webinar today on Southwest Minnesota Arts Council's operating support grants for fiscal year 2022, which for us runs from July 1st, 2021 through June 30th, 2022. I am Carolyn Koska, the grants administrator here at Southwest Minnesota Arts Council. I'll just run down what we're going to talk about today. We'll start out with a quick introduction to Southwest Minnesota Arts Council. We'll look at the guidelines for this grant program. Then we'll go over to our website and show you what resources are there for you. We'll head into our grant system and walk through the application, and then we'll finish up talking about the grant process. In other words, what happens after you submit an application. We'll be stopping a couple times for questions. So if you'd like to note any questions that come up, or feel free to put them in the chat and we'll get those answered during those question breaks. And then at the end, if you'd like to talk some more about your specific organization, we can do that then. So the Southwest Minnesota Arts Council, or SMAC, is a nonprofit organization committed to promoting and encouraging the development of the arts in the 18 counties of Southwest Minnesota by serving as a source of funds and technical services, which enable local organizations, educational institutions, and individuals to sponsor, create, and promote the arts in their communities. So here's our region down in the southwest corner of the state. We are one of 11 regional arts councils that cover the whole state of Minnesota. Our funding comes mostly from the state of Minnesota, some through an allocation from their general fund, but mostly through the Arts and Cultural Heritage or Legacy Fund. We also receive funding from the McKnight Foundation, which we use for some of our grants for artists, and from memberships and donations from our region. Some things that we are committed to include supporting artists and arts organizations in creating, producing, and presenting high quality arts activities, overcoming barriers to accessing high quality arts activities, instilling the arts into the community and public life, supporting high quality, age appropriate arts education for all ages to develop knowledge, skills, and understanding of the arts, and supporting events and activities that represent the diverse ethnic and cultural arts traditions of the region. So these are some things to just keep in mind as you're thinking about applying for grants, because everything we do needs to relate back to these commitments. Now for our grant program of the day, operating support. The intent of this program is to strengthen and stabilize arts organizations in the region to help them just maintain where they're at without needing to have a specific project that they're doing in order to receive grant funds. And these are 2-year grants. And they are most helpful if your organization has a building or office or staff people. To be eligible to apply, your organization's location needs to be within our 18 county service region. Your mission statement should be focused clearly on the arts. You'll need to have at least 2 years of completed arts programming and financials. You'll need a current 501c3 and articles of incorporation on file with the state. Your total annual expenses need to be less than $174,000, which is the amount that makes you eligible to apply to the State Arts Board. And you need to not already be receiving operating support from another funder. We have 2 levels of funding for our operating support. Both of these are based on your average annual expenses for 2 years. So as you're getting ready to apply, there's a pre-application deadline where you need to submit that financial information so we can determine how much you are able to request. So for the level 1, if your average annual expenses are under $25,000, you'll be able to request up to 35% of those expenses for each of the 2 years. Then at level 2, if your average annual expenses are from $25,000 up to $173,999, you can request up to 15% of your average expenses for each of the 2 years. And one thing to keep in mind is that if you receive operating support from us, you can't include prorated operating type costs in a budget for any other grant requests to us during that time period. So we'll look at some things to be aware of for eligibility aside from those specific requirements we talked about for being eligible for operating support. These apply to all of our grants in general. So we can't fund projects that don't have an art focus, educational projects within a school system, unless that school applies under our Arts in the Schools grant program. Activities of a for-profit project or business, activities that take place outside of Minnesota, since we are using state funds for these grants, new construction or purchase of real estate, activities for the religious socialization of the participants or audience, fundraising events, payments of debts that are incurred before your grant period begins, grant funds being used to match another SMOC grant, or if you have a past due final report. So it's a good idea to check these general grant guidelines along with the program guidelines, especially just to be aware of everything you need to know to make sure you are eligible and on the right track. And we'll take a look at where to find these guidelines in a little bit. 4-year projects start and end date. These grants are, you don't really need to choose one because it's already determined for you. So for the first year, the funding period will run from January 1st through December 31st of 2022. And then year 2 will run the following year, January 1st through December 31st of 2023. And just as a reminder, no funds can be spent before January 1st. So we have kind of a 2-part deadline. You'll need to first submit your 2-year financial statement in September to determine the amount that you can request. And then your full application will be due in October. And these grants are offered every other year since it's a 2-year grant. So after this year, when we're accepting applications, the next deadline would be fall of 2023 for funding starting January 1st of 2024. So the actual dates for these deadlines, the pre-application is due September 15th, and the actual application is due October 20th. The pre-application is just this form that you need to email us, so that's not through our grant system, but the application is. So when you're submitting the application, you should be aware that you'll need to have that submitted by 4:30 p.m. on the deadline date, since the system won't allow you to submit after that time. You'll need to have a couple of people tied with your project. For operating support, it may not be as clear who you might choose as a project director versus an authorizing official. So the project director is who's ever most directly responsible for that project, and authorizing official, someone from your organization who has authorizing power, like a president or treasurer. So as I said, for this operating support, it's not a big deal which person you assign to project director versus authorizing official, but you will still need those 2 people who are going to be signing off on your application. Again, they can't be the same person, and they'll need to sign the application, contract, and final report. And we will stop now for a little bit for any questions. Feel free to unmute and ask questions or type something into the chat.
Hi.
Hi.
Yeah, we recently got a $5,000 grant for sustainability. And so it was an opportunity for us to evaluate our board and what else?
Yeah, it was a development grant through SWIFT. have a consultant in how to maximize the talent on the board, bring people in where we have gaps, and work towards, and then work into the financial end of things, how to be more sustainable over the long haul.
I was just wondering, would that be in conflict with our application to the operating support grant?
No, that shouldn't be any problem. That's just kind of a development project that you have going on. So
okay,
that's fine.
The other one, though, that I think we'd have to think about here, the Minnesota State Arts Board has one out now coming up. It's a $15,000 operating support stabilization type grant. It seems that would probably be one or the other, or decreased one by the amount of the other or something, or what are your thoughts?
Yeah, the State Arts Board has specific operating support grants that are called operating support. And then this is, I think they've pared down some of their grants and are just having like support for organizations in general, which can include project type things or kind of however you want to use it. So if you had applied for one of those grants, that should be okay. It's just if you're applying for their specific operating support grant, in which case you would have to have a budget of $174,000 or greater.
Oh, okay. Yeah, I see what you're saying. To be comparable to what you're doing. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it's called the American Rescue Plan grants. So I see what you're saying for a difference there. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Where does one find that pre-app budget spreadsheet?
Yeah, we'll head over to that when we're done with some questions here. Okay. So just let me know when you're ready.
Okay, yeah, I think that was it for now.
All right, then we are going to go over to our website. So a couple things first on our website. The easiest place to get to our grant system is on our homepage. If you scroll down below the slides there, there's this black grants box with a login button. So that'll be your quickest way to get into the grant system. We're going to look for a moment at this workshops and assistance page. This is just the sort of quickest thing to check to see what's going on, to get some questions answered. We have our grant support open office hours that are the second Tuesday of each month. You can just stop into our office anytime from 10 to 2 if you'd like to bring all your things along with you and sit there and work on your application with us there to answer any questions. You can do that. Or maybe you just have something you want to talk through, so you can stop in during that time. That'll be next Tuesday, the 10th is the next one coming up. We also have some grants Q&A sessions planned for the year. The first one of those is coming up also on August 10th. And this one is in the evening. We'll just be open to any questions that people have about our grants. You can schedule some time to meet with me or send me an email anytime. And then here are all of our webinars that we have on each of our grant programs. So you can either register, or some of these ones whose dates have already passed, you can take a look at the recording from that. So that's just a place to stop if you are looking for some help. But now we'll head over to our operating support page. And right as we get to that page, there's this Apply Now button here, which is another way that you can get to our grant system. So we've got some information here about deadlines again, the pre-application and the actual application, and then kind of the schedule of how those will be reviewed. Then we have the materials that are available for you here. We have the guidelines for this program along with our general grant guidelines. So that's where you can find those. Here is the form you'll fill out for the pre-application, and we'll look at that in just a second. We have the application questions in a Word document for you if you prefer to work on a draft in that first and then paste into the system later. Here are the criteria that the reviewers will use to score your application and some information about using the grant system. But we're going to take a look at this financial statement form for your pre-application. Here is our form. So you can enter in your name up here. One thing that it tells you as far as choosing the years you're going to use for your average. Normally, we would ask for your fiscal years 2019 and 2020. However, this year, we are giving the option to omit 2020 since that was just a strange year and provide information from 2018 and 2019 instead. And then it just points out you've got these notes fields for any information you need. So you'd fill in your year at top, what you had at the beginning of the year, just sort of your cash on hand, what's in all of your bank balances. Then you'll enter in your income that you have, including any SMOC operating support that you received during those 2 years that you're using. So you've got several spaces to put in that information and any other descriptions you want to add in the notes. Then you have your expenses, and it's got a specific line for any capital expenses. So these would be large improvements, things like that, because we are both those capital expenses and the operating support we're going to involve in our formulas later. But otherwise, you can just fill in your expenses here, and then it'll calculate your year-end balance for you. Then this line will subtract out the amount of any of those capital expenses that you have and the amount of the operating support that you had received, if any, during those years, and leave you with your eligible expenses for those 2 years. Then it will calculate out here your average expenses based on those eligible expenses for the 2 years, and then we'll calculate out the amount that you can actually request. It will look at how big is that average? Is it under or over the 25,000? And then calculate out the 35 or 15% for you here. So this is the form that you'll need to fill out and email to us for your pre-application. And here it has the email address to send that. So now we're going to head over into the grant system. And if you are returning to the system, you've worked in here before, you could just log in. If you are new to the system, you can create a new account here. If you're not sure if you or somebody from your organization already has an account, please talk to us and we can get that figured out for you so you're not creating extra accounts that are not needed. So we're going to log in, and if you are, again, returning to the system, you'll come to your applicant dashboard. But if you are coming into the system for the first time, you will come to this apply page. So this lists all of the grants that are currently open for applications, and we'll scroll through. Here's our operating support. Again, here's another spot. We've got that link to the financial statement form for the pre-app. If you want to just take a look at the application without actually starting anything, you can click this preview button. Otherwise, if you're ready to get started, you can click apply, which is what we're going to do. A couple things to point out at the top of the application here. If you would like to work in another language, we have Google Translate embedded into the site, so you can choose that language. It'll translate the interface and questions for you. Here is our copy previous answers button. If you have applied in the system before, you can choose an application from which to copy any answers that are the same between the two applications over into this new one. We also have our collaborate button. And this is so somebody can be working on the application with you. You'd put their email address in here, choose what level of permission you'd like to give them, and then just send them this message asking them to do whatever it is. If you want them to add some numbers in here for you, or do some proofreading, or come in and do their electronic signature, that you would just explain that, whatever it was you wanted them to do, and invite them. They will receive an email and will just be required to create a password to come in and work on the application also. And as you're working, there are several ways to get questions answered or get some help. If you'd like to schedule some time with me, you can just click here. This will bring you to my calendar. You can choose how you'd like to meet. And you can just choose a day and time on my calendar, and that'll set up a meeting for us. Otherwise, feel free to email me, which my address is here. So you'll start with just some basic things. You've got your name of your project, which we've got that already laid out for you there, the amount that you're requesting. And this is actually asking for the amount for 1 year, not the total amount over 2 years. And your request can't be more than that amount that was approved in your pre-application. And then it lets you know what to fill in for your project start and end dates. We have also for you here just some links to those documents that we looked at on the website again. Some tips for your grant writing. I'll just touch on the tip about character limits. You'll probably see in the application that our character limit is pretty big, and we are not expecting you to use up all of that room. Answer the question as you feel covers everything that it's asking you about, and that should be plenty. So it might be, depending on the question, a couple sentences, or it might be a few paragraphs. All right, so in the actual application, as we get going here, you'll first give some information about your organization, your mission statement, a brief history, and what kinds of programs you offer. Then we ask you about how you make decisions about artistic programming for your organization. How do you hope to achieve this artistic excellence throughout your programs? Who makes artistic decisions? What kind of process is used to decide that? And then you can attach some samples of things that your organization has been doing that can either be something from some sort of production or concert that you put on if you are an actual performing group, or it might be some examples of artists that you have in your gallery, or performing artists that you bring into the community, things like that. So here are just some guidelines of different kinds of samples you might have, if they're written materials, images, audio, video. Also some links if you need to do some resizing of images or combine multiple files into a PDF. So you can upload samples here. We've got these 3 pretty large upload fields, and you can describe what is in that particular uploaded sample. And then we've also got some places for you to include websites, links to YouTube videos, things like that. Then we ask about sort of your connection to your community. How does your organization fill a need in that community? How do you assess and respond to those needs that they have? And then in return, what support does your organization receive from the community? Do you get volunteers, business supporters, in-kind contributions, things like that? Then also in thinking about the community, we want you to describe the groups in your community that may be underserved or underrepresented. And you could think about defining those by race or ethnicity, language, socioeconomic level, ability, things like that. And then what do you do as an organization to reach out to and involve at least one or some of those groups so that they can participate in your activities that you generally have? Also, you can talk about ADA access, how you make sure that your activities are accessible to those with various disabilities. Then we need some information about personnel from your organization. We ask about your board. How are those members chosen? How often do you meet? And then we ask that you provide information about your board members. You can either type that into this spot after you've answered these questions or upload a separate file. Then we ask for some information about a couple key people from your organization, your either main staff person, or if you don't have staff, the president, and describing what that person does. And you have the option to either upload a resume for that person or describe the kinds of things that might be on their resume. What is their experience? So you do that both for a main staff person and then whomever is responsible for your finances, whether that's a board member or a contractor or staff person. And again, you do the same, either describe their qualifications here or upload a resume. We also ask what you generally do for your marketing and publicity. What methods do you use? What audiences are you trying to reach? Next is some financial information. We ask about what kind of process does your organization have related to finances and planning, about your fundraising plans, who is reviewing your reports and budgets? What is that financial planning process like for your organization? We have a spot for your 2-year financial statement that you provided for your pre-application. You don't need to do anything here. We already have your statement and we can add that into your application here. Then for your plans for the coming 2 years, this is actually a narrative field. We are asking about your budget plans, but you can provide that in a narrative way. This we're hoping will be especially helpful for people whose fiscal year does not align with our funding period for this grant. So we'll ask you to talk about estimated total income, what kinds of sources is this coming from, what makes up the biggest portion of the income you're thinking, and then estimated total expenses for the year. And again, breaking down some of those expense areas. And then be sure to include your at least intent right now for how you might use those operating support funds. Then we just need you to think a little bit about the impact of this funding. And since this funding is going to just your organization to use in general and is really supporting all of your activities in a way, we're asking you to think about just what are your goals overall for this funding period. And if you know what impact these particular funds will have, you can talk about that. Maybe they're freeing up some money by just covering some of the basics to allow you to use your other funds for some programming that you wouldn't normally be able to do. For instance, you'd want to think about what changes may occur to your organization's capacity or stability, to your organization's ability to kind of challenge and stretch itself with its programming, or perhaps it has some changes related to skills, knowledge, attitude, or behavior of all of the people who come in contact with your organization, whether those are audiences, donors, volunteers, board members, staff members. So this is really a different way of thinking about impact from some of our other grants. Just thinking broadly about your goals for that funding period. Then you'll need to think about how you might plan to measure or prove that those changes have taken place. If you're going to do any sort of gathering of feedback from people, and then once you have gotten that feedback, what in that feedback would indicate that you were successful in achieving those goals. If you are planning to use some sort of evaluation tool like a survey, you can attach that here. We ask for some participation numbers. This would just be what you're expecting as your total audience for that 1 year, for the year of the first funding period. This next section is just some data that we need to collect. Mostly gets just passed on to the state of Minnesota and doesn't really have any bearing on your application. Just some demographics questions. It asks about what your most recently completed fiscal year was, and enter your total expenses for that year and also total audiences for that year. Then we have contact information section, and you can enter the information for the person who will be your project director and your authorizing official. We ask you to just let us know who the grant writer is in case we have some questions and need to contact them. And then we finish off with those electronic signatures. And again, this is a great place to use that collaborate button if you need to have your authorizing official, for instance, come in here and sign. So as you're working on this, the system will be auto-saving for you, but you can also use this save button. And here's the submit for when you're ready, but we're going to click save. And when you save using that actual button, it'll give you a list of the questions that still need to be completed. Since we didn't actually do anything, they're all here, but that'll just allow you to kind of track your progress. And from here, if you wanted to keep working, you'd hit this continue button, but we're going to head back to our dashboard. And you'll see now here's this operating support application that we just started. And to come back in and keep working, there's this edit application link here. And this on your dashboard would be the same place you'd come back to if you need to fill out a grant contract or your final report. Right, I'm going to head back over to our slides for a second and we can stop for some questions again.
You mentioned that copy feature, which we used on a recent, I think on the equipment grant, and that was really quite handy.
Good.
Now my question is, we have 7 or 8 grants that we received. Can you copy from any one of them, or are you limited to picking
Yes,
one?
what happens is it'll bring up, when you click that button, it'll bring up the list of all of the applications that you've done in the system.
Okay.
And depending on which one you choose, there may be possibly fewer questions that are the same that would copy over. So you have to kind of think of that. You know, you'd probably get more things to copy over from a previous grant in the same grant program versus another grant program, but you really can choose any in there.
Okay.
So here are just some tips for you as you are working on your application. It's always a good idea to start early just to make sure you have plenty of time to maybe gather all those work samples that you need or some numbers that you need to figure out, and to get any questions answered that you might run into. Make sure to read over the guidelines carefully, make sure there's not something you're missing and you're on the right track with your application. And then you probably saw in the application itself that most of the questions have multiple parts to them. So make sure that you are touching on all of those in your answers. No need to, like we mentioned before, try and pad out your answers to make them come closer to filling out the text box, and no need for any special grant writing language. You can just use everyday language in your writing as if you were just explaining this to someone you were talking to. Also good to assume that the grant reviewers don't know anything about your organization or your project. We have reviewers from around our whole region, so it is likely that they may not have heard of your organization or be familiar with your programming. So just watch out for things that maybe others might not know what you're talking about. Make sure you're spelling out any acronyms, for instance. So that's a good idea as you're having someone proof your application to have that be someone who doesn't really know a lot about what you're doing, just to, they can catch some of those things that are just sort of assumed in your head that may not have made it onto the paper. Several ways to get assistance with your application. You can give us a call or email to just talk about your project before even starting. Make sure you are eligible and in the right grant program. You can contact us with any questions you run into while you're filling out your application. And then there's also the option of letting us know when you have kind of a draft together, and we can go into the system and take a look at your application before you submit it, and let you know how your application is doing, if you were missing some attachment, or if you really needed to explain a little more in one section, or needed to come at a question from a little different angle. But we can review that for you before you submit it. It's best to request that more than 2 weeks before the deadline, just to make sure that we're able to get to it as it gets closer to the deadline. We can't guarantee that we're able to take a look at it. So what happens after you submit your application? SMOC staff will review it to make sure everything is eligible and complete. And if at that stage we find something missing or that needs to be fixed, you'll be given 48 hours to fix whatever it is. And then that is the staff's kind of last contact with your application. We don't have any say in what gets funded or not. So your applications then will get sent on to a panel of individuals from around our region who will discuss and score the applications based on the criteria for the program, which we'll look at in a second. And then their recommendations go to our board of directors, who make the final funding decisions based on those recommendations. So here are the criteria that will be used in scoring your application. They will look at the artistic quality and merit of your programming. That is worth 15 points. They'll look at your kind of general organizational stability and management, worth 10 points. Your commitment to the community, worth 10 points. And then the impact that you expect this will have, also worth 10 points. And if you open up that document on either within the application or on the website, it'll go into more detail on each of these criteria, so you can get a really good idea of what you'll be scored on. So after the panel scoring, you also may be awarded an additional percentage point for each of the following of these criteria that you may meet. If you are a first-time applicant to SMOC, if your organization is led by or primarily serving BIPOC or LGBTQ communities or people with disabilities, or if your organization is located in a county that has received 3 or fewer grants from us in the last fiscal year. So just some information about if you're awarded this grant, how does the fund distribution work? So in January of 2022, After you have completed a contract for your year one funding, you'll get 100% of the year one grant funds paid out. So that's in January. And a reminder that all of the year one funds need to be spent by the end of that first funding year. And you'll have an interim report due on March 1st, 2023, which is 60 days after the end of that first year. Then for the second year, again, you'll complete a contract and get 100% of, I see a typo here, year two grant funds paid out. Again, those need to be spent out by the end of that second funding year, and your final report will be due March 1st, 2024, again, 60 days after the end of the second funding year. It's a good idea to look through those reports kind of when you're starting your year, just to get an idea of what kind of information you're going to need to gather related to your outcomes and costs. You'll need to acknowledge the grant. It's a little different with acknowledging the grant for operating support versus for an actual project. But you could, for instance, put one of our credit posters in the window, for instance, saying we are receiving operating support from SMOC. It wouldn't necessarily need to go out on advertising for all of your events. But we will provide you with what that credit line needs to be. You may also need to include this Minnesota Legacy logo, and we'll just send you all of that and let you know, so you don't have to guess about getting the right information out there. That's it for operating support. I just wanted to mention a couple other webinars that we have coming up that may be of interest. We have one for our art legacy projects coming up on September 30th. And the grant deadline for that, the next deadline, is November 10th. Then we have another webinar coming up for art projects on November 1st. And the next deadline for that will be December 8th. And here's just some other ways to get a hold of us. Anything else you'd like to talk about?
The only thing, Carolyn, is, I get paid, right?
Mm-hmm.
But I sign my check over to the cultural center. I just endorse it and I give it back. Is that a problem?
Mm-hmm. I don't think so. You'd end up counting it as originally an expense, so you know how much it costs to have your role working there, and then it would come back in as a donation.
Okay. Well, could I just have him call you if all of a sudden he thinks of something?
Yep, sure. Call or email. We're still kind of not all back in the office all the time, so email is probably better.
Well, thank you.
Mm-hmm. Yep. Just let me know if you run into more questions.